Darren stood at the edge of his nest and looked around slowly. Something was wrong. The nest was a wide stone hollow carved deep into the mountain wall, high above the world below. He had built it himself, piece by piece, over many years. Smooth rocks lined the bottom. Dry moss filled the corners. It was warm in the day and protected from the wind at night. It was the safest place on the mountain. But today it was empty. He stepped inside and looked at every corner. The 2 small shells were still there, cracked open and pale, sitting where he had left them 3 days ago. The hatchlings had broken free on their own, just as they should have. He had been so proud when he came back that first morning and found them both standing on their tiny legs, blinking at the world with their strange pink eyes. Albino hatchlings. Both of them. In all his long years, Darren had never seen 2 born together like that. White as snow, with soft pink eyes and small pale claws that could barely scratch the rock beneath them. They were fragile. They were rare. And they were his. He had left them sleeping that morning. They had been curled together in the warmest corner of the nest, pressed close to each other the way young hatchlings do. He had watched them for a moment before leaving. They looked so small. So peaceful. Now they were gone. Darren moved around the nest carefully. He checked behind every rock. He looked along the narrow ledge outside the hollow. He leaned over the edge and looked down the mountain face, his heart pulling tight in his chest. There was nothing. No small white shapes on the rocks below. No sign of a fall. He breathed slowly and told himself to be calm. He lowered his great head to the floor of the nest and breathed in. The scent of his hatchlings was still here, warm and faint like something soft and new. He followed it with his nose along the floor to the edge of the hollow and out onto the ledge. They had walked out on their own. That surprised him. They were barely 3 days old. Their legs were still unsteady. He had not expected them to move far from the nest so soon. But the scent trail was clear. They had gone left along the ledge, toward the narrow path that wound down the eastern face of the mountain. Darren followed it. The path was old and rough, cut by wind and rain over many years. It was wide enough for him to walk carefully, though his body was large and the drop beside him was steep. He kept his eyes on the ground, following the faint trail left by 2 very small sets of claws. The trail went down. He moved slowly, watching every step. The morning was cold and gray. Clouds sat low over the peaks and the air smelled of rain coming. He did not like that. Rain would wash the scent away. He moved faster. The path curved around a wide shelf of rock and then dropped steeply toward the lower slopes. The trees began here, thin and dark, growing out of the rocky ground at odd angles. The scent trail entered the trees and kept going down. Darren pushed through the branches and followed. He had not come this far down the mountain in a long time. He had no reason to. The human village sat at the foot of the mountain, small and quiet, surrounded by fields and a low wooden fence. He had seen it from above many times. He had never gone near it. Humans were not something he trusted. He had lived long enough to know what they did. They hunted dragons when they thought they could win. They took eggs from unguarded nests. They made weapons from dragon scales and sold them in their markets. They were small and soft and they did not live long, but they were clever in ways that made them dangerous. He had kept his distance from them always. But the scent trail was leading him straight toward their village. He stopped at the edge of the trees and looked down the slope. The village was below him, maybe a half-hour walk away. Smoke was rising from a few of the buildings. He could see the fence line and the dark shapes of houses beyond it. Everything looked still and quiet in the gray morning light. He breathed in again. The scent of his hatchlings was faint now but still there, moving down the slope toward the village. His chest felt tight. His claws pressed into the soft ground beneath him. He did not want to go down there. But he had no choice. He told himself they were alive. The scent was not the scent of blood or fear. It was just their scent, small and quiet, drifting down the hill. They had walked this way on their own. Something had drawn them down here. He did not know what. He stepped out of the trees and began walking down the slope toward the village. He kept low and moved carefully, staying off the open path. He moved through the long grass at the edge of the slope, his body close to the ground. He was large and he knew it. He did not want to be seen before he understood what had happened. The village grew closer with every step. He breathed in once more and followed the scent. It led him through the grass, along the outside of the fence, past 2 dark barns, and down a narrow muddy lane at the far edge of the settlement. It stopped at a small cottage at the end of the lane. Darren crouched in the shadow of a tree and stared at it. The door was closed. The window was dark. But the scent of his hatchlings was strong here, warm and clear, coming right from inside that little building. They were in there. Darren did not move for a long time. He stayed crouched in the shadow of the tree and watched the cottage. The building was small and old. The walls were made of rough stone and the roof was patched in two places with fresh wood that did not match the rest. A thin line of smoke had come from the chimney earlier, but it had stopped now. The window on the side facing him was shuttered but not locked. One edge of the shutter hung loose and moved slightly in the cold morning breeze. He watched and he waited. Nothing moved inside. No sound came from the cottage. The lane beside it was empty. The rest of the village was still quiet, though he could hear distant sounds now. A door opening somewhere. The low sound of an animal in one of the barns. A child calling out from somewhere across the settlement. Normal morning sounds. Nothing that suggested anyone knew he was here. He looked along the fence line carefully. He had expected worse. When he first came down the slope and saw the village below him, his mind had gone straight to the worst things. Hunters waiting in the trees. Cages built for young dragons. Ropes and traps set by men who knew how to catch things that were bigger than them. He had heard stories. He had seen what humans could do when they decided a dragon was worth taking. But there was none of that here. The village looked poor and tired. The fence was old and leaning in places. The houses were small. The fields beyond the settlement were narrow and the soil looked thin. These were not wealthy people. They were not hunters or soldiers. They were just people living quietly at the foot of a mountain trying to get through each day. That did not mean they were safe. Darren moved along the outside of the fence slowly, keeping low. He stayed in the long grass and kept his body close to the ground. His size made it hard to hide completely, but the gray morning light helped. The clouds were still heavy and low. No sun had broken through yet. The village was dim and soft in the gray light, and he moved through the edges of it like a shadow. He reached the far corner of the fence and stopped. From here he could see the cottage more clearly. It sat a little apart from the other buildings, separated by a stretch of open ground and a small garden that had gone dry for the season. The garden had a low stone border, and inside it were the dead stems of plants that had grown tall in summer. A wooden bucket sat beside the cottage door. A pair of small worn shoes had been left outside on the step. He looked at the shoes for a moment. They were very small. Child-sized. He moved his gaze back to the window. The loose shutter shifted again in the breeze. Through the small gap at its edge he could see nothing but darkness inside. But the scent was strong here. Stronger than it had been anywhere else on the trail. His hatchlings were inside that cottage. Both of them. He was certain of it now. He moved closer. He crossed the open ground between the fence and the cottage slowly, one careful step at a time. The ground was soft and damp and his steps made almost no sound. He reached the side of the cottage and pressed himself against the stone wall. He could feel the faint warmth still in the stone from the fire that had burned inside the night before. He turned his head toward the window. The gap in the shutter was narrow but enough. He leaned his great head forward and looked through. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the dim light inside. The cottage was one small room. A table stood in the middle with a candle burned almost to nothing sitting on top of it. A low shelf on the far wall held a few bowls and a small clay pot. A pile of folded cloth sat on a wooden chair near the door. The floor was swept clean. Everything in the room was simple and worn but kept with care. In the far corner was a sleeping mat on the floor. Darren looked at it and went completely still. His two albino hatchlings were there. Both of them. They were curled on either side of a small human girl, pressed close against her, their white bodies glowing faintly even in the dim light. Their eyes were closed. Their breathing was slow and steady. They were asleep. The girl was asleep too. She was small and thin, with pale skin and dark circles under her eyes that were visible even in the low light. She looked unwell. Her face was flushed and her breathing was slightly uneven. But her arms were loosely draped over both hatchlings, one on each side, the way a child holds something they do not want to lose. Darren stared at the three of them for a long moment. He had come down this mountain ready for the worst. Ready to tear through walls if he had to. Ready to face hunters and traps and everything that humans were capable of. He had been afraid in a way he had not felt in many years. Not afraid for himself. Afraid for his young ones who were tiny and white and new to the world and had no idea how dangerous it could be. But they were not in a cage. They were not hurt. They were asleep on a mat in a poor little cottage, pressed against a sick little girl who had wrapped her arms around them in the night. He did not move from the window for a very long time. Darren stayed at the window and did not move. He watched the three of them sleeping in the corner of that small dim room. His hatchlings were pressed close against the girl on both sides, their white bodies rising and falling slowly with each breath. They looked warm. They looked safe. They looked more settled than he had ever seen them in the 3 days since they had broken free from their shells. That was the thing that stayed with him. In the nest they had been restless. Always shifting, always making small sounds, always pressing into each other as if searching for something they could not find. He had done everything he could think of. He had warmed the stones around them. He had brought soft moss for them to sleep on. He had curled his own body around the edge of the nest to block the wind. But they had never slept like this. Never this still. Never this quiet. They were sleeping the way young things sleep when they feel completely safe. He looked at the girl. She was young. 6 or 7 years at most. Her hair was dark and loose around her face and her cheeks were flushed with the kind of color that came from fever, not health. She was thin in a way that suggested she had not been eating well for some time. Her clothes were simple and clean but old. The blanket pulled over her legs was worn thin at the edges. She was sick. That was clear. But even in sleep her arms stayed around his hatchlings. Her left hand rested against the back of the nearest one, fingers loosely curled into the soft white scales. It was not a tight grip. It was not the grip of someone trying to hold something. It was the grip of someone who had simply fallen asleep while keeping something warm and had not let go even in sleep. Darren looked at that hand for a long time. He thought about what it meant. This girl had found his hatchlings on the mountain path. 2 small white creatures, barely able to walk, stumbling through the cold in a world they had only just entered. She had not run from them. She had not called for help or gone to fetch adults who might have done something else entirely. She had picked them up or led them or somehow brought them all the way down to this cottage. And then she had kept them. Not in a box. Not behind a locked door. She had kept them the only way a sick little girl in a poor cottage could keep 2 small creatures warm. She had put them beside her and held them through the night. Darren breathed in slowly through his nose. The scent inside the cottage was layered and clear to him. He could smell the cold ash of the fire that had burned out in the night. He could smell the dry herbs hanging from a nail near the shelf. He could smell the fever in the girl, sharp and warm and worrying. And he could smell his hatchlings, their scent deep and familiar and threaded through everything in that room as if they had been there for days. They had been there for days. He pulled back slightly from the window and looked at the lane behind him. Still empty. The village was waking slowly but no one had come this way yet. He turned back to the window and looked inside again. One of the hatchlings shifted in its sleep. It made a small sound, a soft low noise that Darren knew well. It was the sound they made when something disturbed their warmth. The girl stirred at the same moment. Her arm tightened slightly and she turned her head without waking, pressing her cheek closer to the hatchling beside her. The hatchling settled again. The sound stopped. Darren stared at that. The girl had felt the hatchling move in her sleep and had pulled it closer without even waking. As if she had been doing it all night. As if her body had already learned that when one of them moved it needed to be held a little tighter. He did not know what to do with that. He was a dragon lord. He was old and powerful and he had faced things in his life that would break most creatures. He had fought in battles that lasted days. He had survived storms that tore the tops off mountains. He had lived alone in his high nest for more years than this entire village had existed. But standing outside this small window in the gray morning light, watching a sick little girl hold his sleeping hatchlings closer in her sleep, he felt something move in his chest that he had no good name for. It was not anger. He had come down this mountain ready for anger and it had left him the moment he looked through the window. It was not relief either, though that was part of it. It was something older and quieter than both of those things. He stayed at the window for a while longer. The candle on the table had burned out completely now and the room was lit only by the thin gray light coming through the gap in the shutter. In that soft light the 3 of them looked like something from a very old story. The pale hatchlings and the pale sick girl, all curled together on a thin mat in a cold cottage, keeping each other warm through the night. He thought about how cold it had been last night on the mountain. He thought about his hatchlings stumbling down that path in the dark. He thought about what might have happened if she had not found them. He pressed his great head gently against the outer wall of the cottage and stayed there, watching over them from outside until the morning grew a little brighter. Rose came down the lane just as the sky began to lighten. She was carrying a cloth bag over one shoulder and walking with the slow heavy steps of someone who had been on their feet all night. Her hair was pulled back and her coat was old and worn at the elbows. She was looking down at the ground as she walked, watching her step on the uneven stones of the lane. She did not see Darren until she was almost at the cottage door. She looked up and stopped. Everything stopped. Her feet. Her breath. The swing of the bag at her side. She stood completely still in the middle of the lane and stared at the enormous dragon crouched against the wall of her home. Darren looked back at her. He had heard her coming from a distance and had turned to face the lane. He was crouched low, his body pressed close to the ground, his great head level with the roofline of the cottage. He was trying to look as small as he could manage, which was not very small at all. Rose did not scream. That surprised him. He had expected screaming. Most humans screamed when they saw him this close. Some ran. Some grabbed for weapons. This woman did none of those things. She just stood there in the lane with her bag over her shoulder and stared at him with wide, tired eyes. Her hands were shaking. He could see that clearly. But she did not run. He watched her and waited. He had decided on this while standing at the window. He would not move toward her. He would not make any sound that could be taken as a threat. He would simply wait and let her decide what happened next. Rose took one breath. Then another. Then she looked at the window of her cottage. Something shifted in her face when she did that. The pure fear softened into something else. Something that looked almost like understanding. She looked back at Darren and he saw her eyes move over him slowly, taking in his pale hatchlings and the white scales and the fact that he had not moved toward her. She swallowed hard. Then she took one small step forward. Darren stayed still. She took another step. Then another. She was moving toward the cottage door but keeping herself turned slightly toward him as she did it, the way a person moves when they do not want to make any sudden action that might change things. She reached the door and put her hand on it and then stopped. She turned and looked at him fully. Her voice came out quiet and unsteady, but she used it. She told him that she was the girl's mother. That her name was Rose and that the child inside was her daughter Lily. She told him that Lily had been sick for nearly 2 weeks with a fever that came and went. She told him she had been working nights at the village healer's house to earn medicine for Lily because they had nothing left to pay with. Darren listened without moving. Rose took a slow breath and kept going. She told him that 2 days ago Lily had slipped out of the cottage alone while Rose was sleeping after a long night. She had gone up the lower mountain path, which she had been told never to do. Rose had been terrified when she woke and found her gone. She had searched the village and the fields and the edge of the tree line calling her name. Then Lily had come back on her own. She had walked back down the lane in the afternoon with mud on her shoes and her coat pulled tight around something she was holding against her chest. Rose had gone to her and tried to see what she was carrying, and Lily had stepped back and opened her coat just enough for Rose to see. 2 small white creatures. Barely bigger than Lily's 2 fists put together. They were pale and shaking with cold and their pink eyes were half closed. Lily had looked up at her mother and said she had found them on the path and they were cold and she was not leaving them there. Darren felt something tighten in his chest. Rose told him she had not known what they were at first. She had never seen a dragon hatchling up close. She had thought they were some kind of strange mountain animal. But Lily had already made up her mind. She had carried them inside and sat down on the mat and put them in her lap and covered them with the edge of her blanket. She had refused to move. Rose had tried to take them and put them in a box near the fire where it was warm. Lily would not allow it. She said they needed to be held. She said they were scared and cold and alone and that a box was not the same as being held. Rose had argued with her, but Lily was stubborn in the way that sick children sometimes are, with a quiet determination that was hard to fight against. In the end, Rose had let her keep them. She had watched through the night as Lily sat with them and talked to them in a low soft voice and fed them small pieces of dried meat from the shelf. By the time Lily finally fell asleep, the hatchlings were curled against her and sleeping too. Rose stopped talking. She looked at Darren steadily now. The shaking in her hands had slowed. Her voice was tired but clear. She told him she was sorry if Lily had taken something that belonged to him. She told him her daughter had not meant any harm. She told him that Lily had only ever wanted to help. Darren looked at this tired woman standing at her cottage door in the early morning cold. He lowered his head slowly until it was level with hers. And he listened to every word. The morning grew brighter slowly. The clouds were still heavy, but the gray light had softened into something warmer and the lane outside the cottage was quiet and still. Rose stood at her door and Darren crouched against the wall and neither of them moved for a long moment after she finished speaking. Then a sound came from inside the cottage. A small rustling. A soft shifting of weight on the sleeping mat. Then a low quiet sound that Darren knew better than any sound in the world. It was the sound his hatchlings made when they were waking up. He turned his head toward the window. Rose pushed the cottage door open slowly and stepped inside. She left the door open behind her. Darren did not know if that was deliberate or not, but he stayed where he was and watched through the gap. Rose crossed to the mat and crouched down beside her daughter. Lily was stirring. Her eyes were moving under their lids and her arms tightened for a moment around the hatchlings before her eyes opened. She looked up at her mother first. Rose touched her forehead with the back of her hand and something in her face relaxed slightly. The fever had come down in the night. Lily blinked and looked down at the two white hatchlings still pressed against her. She smiled. It was a small tired smile, the smile of a sick child who had not had much to smile about recently. But it was real and it reached her eyes, and she lifted one hand and rested it gently on the nearest hatchling's back. Then the hatchling opened its eyes. It looked up at Lily for a moment with its pale pink eyes. Then it turned its head toward the open door. Then toward the window. Its small body went still in the way that young creatures go still when they sense something large nearby. Its head turned slowly until it was facing the window directly. It had found him. Darren stayed completely still. The hatchling stared at the window for one long moment. Then it made a sound. A high sharp sound that was somewhere between a cry and a call. The second hatchling woke instantly at that sound and lifted its head and made the same sound back. Lily sat up slowly and watched them. Both hatchlings were on their feet now, standing on the mat and facing the window with their small tails moving. They knew he was there. They had always been able to find him by scent, even from the nest when he came back from long patrols. But they did not run straight for the window. They stopped. They turned and looked back at Lily. Darren watched that and felt something move through him that he had no words for. They were 3 days old. They were small and new, and they had only known the world for the length of 3 dawns. But they stood on that worn sleeping mat and looked back at the girl who had carried them down a mountain and held them warm through 2 cold nights. Lily looked at them. She reached out and touched each of them once, very gently, on the top of their small white heads. She said something to them in a low voice that Darren could not fully hear. Then she looked up at the window. She saw him. He had expected her to pull back. He had expected the fear that most humans showed when they saw him close. She was a small sick child and he was very large, and he was right outside her window with his great head almost level with the shutters. But Lily did not pull back. She looked at him with the same calm steady eyes she had used when she looked at his hatchlings on the mountain path. As if large and frightening things were simply part of the world and there was no use being afraid of them. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the hatchlings. Then back at him. She understood. Darren moved slowly. He brought one foreleg forward and reached his great claw toward the open window, keeping his movement as gentle and careful as he could. His claw was longer than Lily's entire arm. He rested it on the windowsill and held it there. Lily looked at it. Then she reached out and placed her small hand on top of it. Her fingers did not even reach across one of his scales. Her hand was warm and light, and he could feel the faint tremble in it, not from fear but from the weakness that came with days of fever. She pressed her palm flat against his claw and looked up at him. She said she had kept them warm. Her voice was small and a little rough from the fever, but it was steady. She said it simply, the way a child states a fact, without asking for anything in return. Darren looked at her for a long moment. Then he lowered his head until it was level with the window and he held it there. Rose made a small sound from somewhere behind Lily. But she did not pull her daughter back. The hatchlings came to the window then. They climbed up and pressed against Darren's claw and made soft sounds, and he felt the warmth of them against his scales. He stayed still and let them take their time. When they were ready, he drew his claw back slowly. The hatchlings followed him out through the window without hesitation and climbed up onto his foreleg and settled there, pressed together, already closing their eyes in the warmth of his scales. Darren looked at Lily one last time. Then he reached up with the careful tip of one claw and pressed it against the edge of one of his own scales on his foreleg. It came free slowly, pale white and smooth and warm, the size of Lily's open hand. He set it on the windowsill. Rose stepped forward and picked it up. She turned it over in her hands and looked at it. It was warm to the touch even in the cold morning air. It glowed faintly the way albino scales do in low light. She did not know what it meant. But Darren looked at Lily one final time and held her gaze for just a moment before he turned and walked back up the lane, his hatchlings curled safe and warm on his foreleg, the village quiet around him. Years later, people in that village would speak about the scale. How it never lost its warmth. How no illness came near that cottage again. How on the nights when Lily's fever tried to return, she would hold it in her hands and the heat would ease it away. They did not fully understand what it was. But in the old dragon realm it had a name and a meaning that went back further than memory. A scale given freely. A life debt declared. A protection that did not end. Lily grew up healthy and strong. And not one creature in the mountains ever came near her with anything but peace.